Right, in this lecture, we're going to talk about the marginal benefit curve and something called consumer surplus. So let's start actually with the demand curve, which we learned about earlier this week. We're going to make a demand curve here on our graph. We're going to say that at $8 right here, we sell one of a good. And then at $1, we'll sell 15 of them. So this is our demand curve here. The more we lower the price, the more quantity we sell. Okay, so that's our demand curve. Now what this demand curve says is that this first consumer here, they're willing to pay $8 for this good. Pretty much everyone else says, no way, $8 is too expensive, we'll pass. But this one person decides that $8 is the value of that good. So therefore, they think that they're going to get $8 worth of benefits from buying this product. Now, if we lower the price a little bit, if we lower it down to $7.50, we now have two people who are willing to purchase that product. We have the first person who would have paid more, they were happy to pay more, but now they don't have to, and we have the second person who decides that the benefit to them of purchasing that product is $7.50. And so on. So we go to consumer number 3. If we lower our price to $7, we'll get one more person here who decides that that product is worth $7, so we sell 3. Now what I want you guys to remember here is that this graph, this reflects the whole market. We're not talking about the quantity that one consumer would buy at different prices. We're talking about the whole market. And what I want to prove here is that the demand curve is the same thing as what we call the marginal benefit curve. The marginal benefit curve is more about these red lines. It's about the benefit that the market gets from an additional sale of a product. So these 3 people here, all together, they are receiving a benefit equal to the height of this line, the height of this line, and the height of this line, all added together. That's their total benefit. So if we do this all the way down our marginal benefit curve or demand curve, we end up with all these benefits, and each line on its own represents the marginal benefit to the market of selling that one additional piece. The marginal benefit, remember that's one additional. If we add them all together, then we get the total benefit that the market received. So I'm just going to make a note here. This line, this is the marginal benefit the market receives from selling one more unit. Each of those lines is a marginal benefit line. So that's why we call this the marginal benefit curve. Same thing as the demand curve. We're just looking at it from a slightly different angle, and it tells us something a little bit different about our data set. So that's the marginal benefit curve. So that thing that it tells us that's slightly different is consumer surplus. So let's back up from consumer surplus for a second, and let's look at our demand curve or our marginal benefit curve again. And let's just say that we decide to price our product at $5. So right here on our demand curve, $5. At $5, we get 7 consumers who are willing to pay that price, right? $5, we get 7 consumers. So that means that the market in total has paid 7 times 5, right? That's the amount that our business, whatever it is, whatever we're selling, that's the amount that our business gets. 7 times 5, 7 items at $5. So if you think about this in terms of geometry, that means that the area of this rectangle is equal to the amount that the market pays, the amount that all the consumers in the market spend collectively on that item. That is this rectangle, because we know that the area of a rectangle is its base times its height. So we're going to use geometry here to figure out the total paid by the market. That green rectangle. Okay, so consumer surplus. If we price our item at $5, that means that most people who are buying it are getting more benefit than what we paid for it. Remember over here on our marginal benefit curve, each one of these lines here is the benefit that customer decides they're going to get from the product. So these customers over here, customer 1, customer 2, customer 3, customer 4, customer 5, customer 6, they're all getting more benefit than they paid for. They were willing to pay more, but they only had to pay $5, right? So we can calculate our total consumer surplus. Here, let's back up really quick. Okay, so this first customer, they were willing to pay $8, but because we don't auction everything off, we set a price and everyone pays the same price. They were willing to pay $8, but they only had to pay $5. Therefore, they get a $3 surplus of benefit, right? They get $3 more benefit than they paid for. The second person, they paid $5, but they thought that the product was worth $7.50, so they got $2.50 of surplus. This third person, same thing. They were willing to pay $7, they only had to pay $5, so they get $2 of surplus. If we took the height of each of these lines and we added them up, we would get the total consumer surplus. The total consumer surplus, the total extra benefit that the market receives above what they paid for that product. Okay, so just like we use geometry to calculate the total that the market paid by calculating the area of our green rectangle, we can use geometry to calculate our consumer surplus by calculating the area of this triangle. So the area of this triangle will represent this consumer surplus plus this consumer surplus plus this consumer surplus plus this consumer surplus, and so on, plus this this height that's on the axis. This height that's on the axis. Now I did not extend our marginal benefit curve all the way up to the axis because we were talking about like what these things mean, and we can't have like less than one person consuming a product, right? You're either selling 0 of the product or you're selling 1 or more of the product. But for theoretical reasons, we have to include that very top corner of the triangle in our calculation. So we're going to calculate this area here inside the triangle. And to do that, we know from geometry that the area of a triangle is 1/2 its base times its height. So we're talking about the base, this distance here, times the height, this distance here. So we have 1/2, our base is 7, right? That distance is 7. Our height, we start at the 5, is 1, 2, 3 and a half, where the line, if it theoretically continued to 0 consumers, would hit the axis. So 3.5 is our height, and that means we have 1/2 of, let's see, what is that? 24.5. 24.5. So we end up with a consumer surplus of $12.25, so $12.25. That's our consumer surplus. That is the extra benefit the market receives over what they pay for. It's the consumer surplus. That's our definition. All right, so what happens if there is a change in price? So let's just say that in this graph, we are talking about a big commodity like wheat. And in this situation, the government has decided to issue what's called a subsidy to wheat farmers. Now, a subsidy means that the government artificially lowers the price, so it allows consumers to pay less, and then the government gives the farmer a subsidy to make up for that drop in price, so that the farmer doesn't make less, but then the consumer also has to pay less. So this is common in large commodity crops like wheat. So let's just say that there's a subsidy and it drops the price of wheat to $3. Right here, wheat is now $3 rather than $5. The consumer surplus then at $3 is the area of this whole triangle here. This whole triangle. And something that we as economists would be really interested in is this difference here. The difference in the consumer surplus between wheat sold at $5 and wheat sold at $3. So we're going to call this the difference in consumer surplus. We can use the Greek letter delta, which is just a triangle, and that just means difference in. We use this a lot in economics and other subjects where we look or we use math and graphs to look at outcomes. So I'm going to say difference in consumer surplus is that area there. It's this area here, below the yellow triangle and inside the red triangle. So we can calculate that by calculating the area of our whole rectangle, the red triangle. It's the consumer surplus. We'll just put a little red triangle there to remind us that that's what that is, equals 1/2. What is our base here? Our base is 11. And our height starts at 3 and is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. So if we keep going with this math, we end up with 1/2 of, let's see, that's 60.5. So that equals, oops, don't necessarily want that parentheses there. So that equals $30.25. That's my consumer surplus of wheat at $3. And let's see what we said our consumer surplus of wheat at $5 was, what did we say it was? We said it was $12.25. So the difference in the consumer surplus between those two prices would be 30.25 minus 12.25. And that gives us $18. Now, in reality, if we were looking at this kind of a chart for, on like a national scale, we have way more than 15 consumers that we're talking about. So this number would be a lot bigger. It would be a lot bigger. And if we were economists or policymakers, we would be really interested in what this difference in consumer surplus means, because consumer surplus, it's really a measure of the consumers as a whole market, the consumer's economic welfare. Oops. So it's a measure of the consumer's economic welfare. In general, when consumer surplus is high, if this number is high, that means that consumers are doing really well. There's a high economic welfare. Consumers are getting a lot more utility than they are paying for, so we're all happy. If consumer surplus, on the other hand, is low, this means that the consumer is not doing so great. Low consumer surplus is low consumer economic welfare. So consumers don't make out quite as well. Yeah, that's all I have to say about doing those calculations. And next we'll move on to how this is used in reality. How do economists use the consumer surplus? We already talked about the consumer surplus as being a measure of economic welfare for consumers. And we discussed subsidies a little bit. So other government policies that affect price, like taxation. When you tax a certain good, it becomes more expensive for consumers. So the opposite of what we just looked at happens. It shrinks the consumer surplus, meaning that there's a decline in the consumer well-being, the economic welfare of consumers. Policies like subsidies, which lower the price, increase the consumer surplus, increasing the economic welfare of consumers. So that's how policymakers might use the idea of consumer surplus. But what about businesses? Consumer surplus can also help businesses to understand how consumers value their products and compare them to alternatives or substitutes. We talked about substitutes earlier this week. Cheaper substitutes might have the same benefit, or they might have less benefit. So for example, I'm using an iPad to write and record this lecture. Now I'm told that Amazon has like a cheap substitute for an iPad, but it doesn't like write as well, and it's harder to use, and it probably doesn't last as long. So that's a cheaper substitute that has less benefit. If there's a change in consumer surplus between a product that has, let's back up. So if you had a substitute that had the same benefit, a cheaper substitute has the same benefit as a product, which is not the case in my iPad, but if it has the same benefit, then it would have a greater consumer surplus because it's a less expensive product, meaning more people will buy it, but they're getting the same amount of benefit. So our consumer surplus goes up. And that might influence a company to produce a cheaper product themselves when they compare their product to a substitute. So that's the marginal benefit curve and consumer surplus. Remember, the marginal benefit curve is the same thing as the demand curve, and consumer surplus is the total extra benefit received by the market above what they pay for a product. And it's used in these ways by businesses and by government policymakers, and it's the measure of economic welfare of consumers.